Now, before I delve into the latest updates in the George Floyd court case, I think it's really important that I pause and take this time to address something that comes up a lot every time I cover cases like this, and specifically this case, this topic in specific. And that is this compulsion that some of you, yes, you out there in the audience have, to bring up what I can only describe as stupid, pointless, irrelevant information into the video topic as if it has anything to do with what we're talking about when it clearly doesn't. And if you find yourself delivering stupid, pointless, irrelevant information, then please listen closely to what I'm about to say. I do not care. I don't care about your relevant information. I don't care at all. It doesn't interest me. I have no interest in hearing it. Do I need to say it in any other possible way? Can I make this any more clear? And two of the most common forms of stupid, pointless, irrelevant information are George Floyd's criminal record as it relates to a pregnant woman sometime in the 90s. This has nothing to do with the court case at hand. This video is about the court case at hand. If you want to emotionally screech about that, feel free to do so on a video that's about that. Again, as I've said before, and I'll say again, that is relevant to the George Floyd being painted as a saint discussion, but not at all relevant to the circumstances of this case and how those circumstances will lead up to the trial. Also, on the same vein as emotionally pointless, stupid, pointless, irrelevant information, is people talking about the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that a knee was on George Floyd's neck. This magical 8 minutes and 46 seconds. The 8 minutes and 46 seconds that's the checkmate to all factual-based arguments around this case related to the trial. Unfortunately for you, that's not how court cases work. Nobody cares about your pseudo-religious emotional appeals and this 8 minutes 46 seconds magic timeline. That's not how the jury's going to consider the case. That's not anything to do with the charges. It doesn't say second degree murder fits all of these specific circumstances unless there's a knee to the neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. So stop bringing it up. I don't care. Not interested in it whatsoever. If you want to know my position on police and whether or not they should use neck pressure, then maybe look through my videos and see why I feel that the NYPD are actually correct on this issue. Alright, we good? Let's move on to the updates of the video. Now, there have been some recent developments in the George Floyd case. Some of these developments benefit the defense team, and some of these developments actually benefit the prosecution. And since the prosecution has been taking hit after hit by the defense team so far in the preliminary process of this trial, I do want to talk about the two things that did come up that actually do in fact benefit the prosecution, because they're pretty desperate for a win. They clearly upped the charges on the officers without any cause to up the charges. In fact, cause to the contrary, so they're basically desperate for any win that they can get. And the first win that they got was a procedural win, because it was discovered recently that in May of last year, not this year, 2019 is what we're talking about, George Floyd, while being in the custody of police officers, actually swallowed drugs. And he swallowed these drugs, and it was so damaging to him that he ended up having to be hospitalized for a drug overdose. Now, obviously, this being introduced, along with the defense's new assertion that George Floyd swallowed drugs in this police encounter, and that swallowing of the drugs can maybe be seen on video, would have been a death nail for the prosecution's case against these officers. However, the judge has ruled that this information has nothing to do with the case, and therefore it's inadmissible. So even though it's out there in the public and it might change your opinion on whether or not George Floyd died of an overdose or he was killed by the officers, and maybe it won't, most people already have their opinion set in stone, this will not be presented to a jury, which is a win for the prosecution. Now, the other major win for the prosecution is something that's not even necessarily procedural. It has nothing to do with whether or not they're going to admit certain evidence into the case or not, but it has to do with the tactics that the officers are going to take in terms of their defense. And it looks like right now that the officers are going to try to go for separate trials. Now, this is a huge win for the prosecution, because there's an old phrase, if you're not familiar with it, if there are 3 people on a boat and one of them's dead, either both or neither of the 2 other people are going to go down for that murder. And that basically says that when you're in a situation like this, it's way better to go as a team to try to defend yourselves than to have every individual point the finger at one another. that's almost a guaranteed way in many circumstances to get yourselves convicted. And even though I don't believe that necessarily fully applies to the 4 officers in this case, I think that this significantly hurts Officer Derek Chauvin, because obviously from the video, he would be the one, if any of them, that would be the most culpable. Obviously, the Asian cop that was doing crowd control, there's basically no case against him, so it would be to his benefit to basically throw Chauvin under the bus because he didn't do anything except crowd control, and the other younger officers were following the superior officer on the scene and his orders. Also, the other officers clearly on the video showed more concern for George Floyd's medical condition than did Officer Derek Chauvin. I mean, that's an opinion, but it's an opinion that is supported by the videos. So obviously this significantly hurts Officer Chauvin. The best case scenario for him is for all these officers to go for a trial at the same time. Now I'm sure the lawyers, and specifically the people representing Officer Derek Chauvin, know this to be true, and this is why Chauvin's lawyer, more than any other one, is going to try to rally the troops and get them to face these charges alone, but the other officers, knowing that they're less culpable, might see their best advantage in order to get off on these charges as pointing the finger at Officer Derek Chauvin. So that's a good break for the defense. That means you have the potential for other officers to be testifying against other officers in these proceedings, which greatly increases the chances that the defense will secure some convictions. However, unfortunately for the prosecution, the victories in the pretrial arena basically ended right then and there, because everything else that appears to have come out in the last couple of weeks since we last covered this story has been significantly damaging to the prosecution's case. Now, we already went over, and I have full videos on this, you guys can click the links in the description if you want to watch it, how the body cam footage and the transcripts significantly hurt the prosecution's case. They show that Floyd was not compliant with the officers. He was resisting arrest from the jump. They also show that he was incredibly erratic, which supports the defense's claim that drugs played a major role in George Floyd's death. And more importantly, in fact, most importantly, or one of the most important things to undercut what I was just saying, it shows that Floyd was in breathing distress well before the knee was placed on his neck. On top of that, and this is most important, the officers were aware of this, they took note of this, and they called an ambulance based on his medical distress. Yes, they were trying to restrain him because he was resisting arrest, kicking the officers, and fighting them every step of the way, despite what our left-wing idiots might tell you that is the case, but they were concerned about his medical health, and that's why they called the ambulance, and they even thought that Floyd was going into a drug-induced excited delirium syndrome episode. So this is not a case of the officers intentionally killing George Floyd. Remember, I said when the original video was out and all I had was the transcripts, that the first video appears to be the worst thing that we're ever going to see, and that is still held true to this day. Everything that has come out since then has been a mitigating factor for the officers involved in this case. But it actually gets worse for the prosecution, because the defense has decided, and we've discussed why this is a good strategy in the past, to zero in on the autopsy and cause of death when it relates to George Floyd. And the reason that this is a good strategy by the defense is because there has been presented no scientific evidence whatsoever that George Floyd died of asphyxiation. Now pause if you don't believe that to be true, if you heard about the family's autopsy coming to the conclusion that that was asphyxiation, because that is not the case. That was not based on anything found at autopsy. You can hear Michael Baden say that himself in this clip that I'm about to play for you.
The compressive pressure of the neck and back are not seen at autopsy because the pressure has been released by the time the body comes to the medical examiner's office. It can only be seen, serious compressive pressure on the neck and back can only be seen while the pressure is being applied, or when, as in this instance, it is captured on video.
Take it from the guy who did the family's autopsy. He based his diagnosis on the video, not on any physical evidence found at autopsy, which is a problem for the prosecution, especially if the defense is trying to push the possibility that Floyd happened to die from an overdose at the time that he was being restrained by the police officers. Another huge problem is that even the state's autopsy, which diagnoses his death as complications from police restraint during arrest, doesn't really hold up under medical scrutiny when you examine what the medical examiner actually put forward. Again, the medical examiner found no significant fatal injuries or potentially fatal injuries to George Floyd's neck or to his back at autopsy. So there's no evidence to support the idea that there was enough pressure from the knee to the neck to kill George Floyd. That's not to say that definitively the knee to the neck wasn't the thing that caused George Floyd to die. That's not to say that Officer Chauvin did nothing wrong. That's not to say that Officer Derek Chauvin did something smart by putting his knee on the neck of somebody who already reported to be in respiratory distress. All I am saying is what is seen in the medical examiner's report is that there's not really strong evidence for his diagnosis of cause of death. By the contrast, there is evidence, clear-cut as day, that Floyd had a lethal level of fentanyl in his system. And when you have a subject that symptoms align for cause of death with two different scenarios, and there's real clear scientific evidence for one of those scenarios, and there isn't for other scenarios, it doesn't really matter what's on video, because court is about what you can prove, and for the defense, it's about creating reasonable doubt. And again, this isn't even going to the charges. If they can create reasonable doubt on actually cause of death, then that basically nerfs the prosecution before they can even get into the charges and tag the officers with anything. But it actually gets worse because that's all stuff that we knew before, because the defense team decided to request for memorandums that were written up prior to the final report by the medical examiner, and those memorandums are damning for the prosecution's case that Floyd was even the victim of a homicide at the hands of these officers. And I'll quote directly from the final sentence of the memorandum, and you can see why this is a huge problem for the prosecution, and this memorandum is a win for the defense. If Mr. Floyd had been found dead in his home, parentheses, or anywhere else, and there were no other contributing factors, he would conclude that it was an overdose death. If you're the prosecution, that is not something that you want to see on any paperwork coming from the medical examiner that's asserting that the cause of death in this scenario is a homicide, especially when the defense are using the tactic of calling cause of death into question. Also, and this is crucial, that sentence is not just based on the fact that this guy had high levels of fentanyl in his system. It's actually based on some medical evidence that was found at autopsy that doesn't exactly align with the knee to the neck being cause of death in this scenario. I will quote again from the medical examiner's preliminary report, the memorandum. Fentanyl at 11 nanograms per milliliter, he said. That's pretty high. This level of fentanyl can cause pulmonary edema. Mr. Floyd's lungs were 2 to 3 times their normal weight at autopsy. That is a fatal level of fentanyl under normal circumstances. Again, if you're the prosecution, this memorandum is a nightmare. The fact that this and the still of Floyd allegedly swallowing something that could potentially be drugs have been approved by the judge to be introduced as evidence as the case, it's something that you are quaking in your boots over, because this is going to torpedo the case against Officer Derek Chauvin, because again, the prosecution has to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense has to create that reasonable doubt in the minds of the jurors. And once again, and to make this even more clear, this isn't even getting into the charges against the officers, whether the homicide was intentional, which is a ridiculous charge, or it wasn't intentional. This is calling into question cause of death. If you can create reasonable doubt in this arena of the story, then there's no way you're going to convict them of anything down the road. Now, a lot of people try to take this a little bit too far. Maybe they don't understand what the defense has to do, and they think that the defense, for some reason, has to prove innocence beyond a reasonable doubt, and they say that this is evidence that even the medical examiner says that George Floyd died of an overdose. That is not the case. If you read this, he says, except for the other circumstances, I would diagnose this as an overdose, and his final report is clear that it is a homicide. An overdose would not be recorded by the medical examiner as a homicide. That's not how that works. but that's an overreach based on people who are just trying to get their answer out there and are not really concerned or knowledgeable about what needs to be proved in this case in order for these officers to be convicted. Again, cause of death, that's something that we can have a discussion about if you want to have a discussion about it. But whether or not you can prove cause of death beyond a reasonable doubt is what we're talking about when we're examining these medical examiner reports. And you best believe that the defense team is going to have some medical examiner to say that cause of death was due to an overdose at trial. They're looking for the guy right now, and he's going to look clean, and he's going to present himself well, and he's going to only strengthen the defense's arguments. But right now, the report that we have does indicate homicide, even with the information that I've given you throughout this. It's a weak homicide diagnosis, for sure. It probably won't stand up in a court of law, but that is what it says. Don't misinterpret this based on somebody putting out irresponsible headlines. But setting aside the bad information that's out there, the clickbaity headlines that are either done due to ignorance or just trying to get you to click on something that's stupid, now you know the important information and what the implications are of that information being decided to be admissible or inadmissible in a court of law as it relates to this case. Unfortunately for me, I broke my light bulb and I'm using a battery powered one, so I gotta wrap it up, but let me know what you guys think down in the comments below before this light starts flickering at me and starts annoying the crap out of me again as it did before. I don't have a backup battery charge because yes, while I prepare with all the facts, evidence, and relevant information for the cases that I talk about, I don't prepare with backup batteries because that's for nerds, and this isn't a nerd channel, despite the fact that we talk about criminal cases in a nerd way. So leave your comments down in the comments below. You guys know the drill with liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like the video, want to share it, and want to see more, you can follow me on the social media links. They're in the description of this video. Also, the support links are there as well. Till next time.